The cleaning cart squeaked down the marble hallway of Whitmore Hall as 17-year-old Elena Martinez pushed it toward the faculty offices. Behind one of those mahogany doors, her mother Carmen was emptying wastebaskets and dusting bookshelves, just as she had every evening for the past 12 years. What neither of them knew was that in exactly 18 months, Elena would be walking these same halls, not with a mop and bucket, but with a Harvard faculty ID clipped to her blazer. The journey from that cleaning cart to the professor's podium would shatter every assumption about who belongs in the ivory towers of academia. And it would start with a single, devastating laugh that would echo through Elena's mind for years to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Martinez had memorized every crack in the linoleum floor of East Boston High School by the time she turned 16. Not by choice, but because she spent most lunch periods in the library, hunched over textbooks while her classmates gathered in the cafeteria. The library was quieter, cheaper, and most importantly, it kept her invisible from the questions she couldn't answer about her clothes, her lunch, or why she never joined them at the mall after school. Her mother Carmen left their cramped two-bedroom apartment every weekday at 5 p.m. sharp, taking 2 buses to reach the prestigious Whitmore University campus, where she worked as part of the evening cleaning crew. Carmen spoke little English when she first arrived from Guatemala 15 years earlier, but she understood enough to know that education was Elena's only ticket to something better. Every evening, she would return home with stories from the university, snippets of conversations she'd overheard between professors, fragments of lectures that drifted from open classroom doors, and most importantly, discarded academic papers that she carefully smoothed out and brought home for Elena to read. Elena devoured these academic scraps like treasure. Philosophy papers on ethical frameworks, psychology studies on cognitive development, literature analyses that dissected novels she'd never heard of. Each page opened new worlds that felt both impossibly distant and tantalizingly within reach. She taught herself to decode academic language, to follow complex arguments, and to think in ways that her high school curriculum never demanded. By junior year, Elena was solving calculus problems that her math teacher had never seen, writing essays that referenced philosophers her English teacher had to Google, and asking questions in science class that made her teachers pause mid-lecture. But excellence in East Boston High didn't translate to the resources she needed for college applications. There were no college counselors tracking her progress, no standardized test prep courses, and certainly no family connections to smooth the way into elite universities. That's when Mrs. Patricia Holloway entered the picture. Dr. Holloway was a philosophy professor at Whitmore University who had a habit of staying late in her office, often working well into the evening when Carmen's cleaning crew made their rounds. Unlike many faculty members who barely acknowledged the cleaning staff, Patricia had always been kind to Carmen, greeting her in Spanish and asking about her family. It was during one of these brief conversations that Carmen mentioned her daughter's academic interests. "She reads everything," Carmen had said in her careful English, gesturing toward a stack of discarded philosophy papers. "Even the papers from your wastebasket." "She asked me questions I cannot answer." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "What kinds of questions?" Carmen pulled out a crumpled sheet from her cleaning cart, one of Elena's handwritten responses to a paper on existentialism that had been thrown away. Patricia unfolded it, expecting to see the typical high school-level analysis. Instead, she found a sophisticated critique that challenged the paper's central argument with references to Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Camus that most of her undergraduate students couldn't manage. "Did your daughter really write this?" Patricia asked. Carmen nodded proudly. "She writes many like this. At home, after I bring papers." That weekend, Patricia drove to East Boston, a 40-minute journey from her comfortable suburban home that might as well have been crossing into another country. The apartment building where Eleanor lived was a far cry from the manicured campus of Whitmore University. Paint peeled from the exterior walls, and the narrow hallways smelled of cooking oil and cleaning supplies. But when Patricia knocked on apartment 3B and Elena answered the door, she immediately recognized something special in the 17-year-old's eyes, an intellectual hunger that reminded her of her own younger self. "I'd like to talk to you about your writing," Patricia said simply. What followed was a 3-hour conversation that would change both of their lives. Elena sat at the small kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of academic papers and her own handwritten analyses, explaining her thoughts with a clarity and depth that impressed Patricia more with each passing minute. Here was a mind that had educated itself in isolation, developed its own sophisticated frameworks for understanding complex ideas, and done so without any formal guidance or encouragement. "Have you thought about college?" Patricia asked eventually. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With what money? And anyway, places like Whitmore, they're not for people like me." "What do you mean, people like you?" "People whose mothers clean the buildings instead of teaching them." Patricia leaned forward. "Elena, I want you to understand something. Intelligence doesn't care about your zip code or your mother's job. Intellectual curiosity doesn't require a trust fund. What you've accomplished here, teaching yourself philosophy and critical thinking without any formal instruction, that's remarkable." But Eleanor had heard enough empty encouragement from well-meaning teachers over the years. "Remarkable doesn't pay for college applications, Professor Holloway. Remarkable doesn't get you into Harvard when you can't afford test prep courses or application fees." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, studying the young woman across from her. She saw not just potential, but actualized brilliance that was being wasted by circumstance. "What if I told you there might be another way?" Over the next several weeks, Patricia became Elena's unofficial mentor. She provided SAT prep books, helped navigate the complex world of college applications, and most importantly, introduced Eleanor to the concept of full-need financial aid at elite universities. But more than that, she began inviting Elena to audit some of her undergraduate philosophy courses at Whitmore. Elena's first day sitting in on Introduction to Ethics was terrifying. She arrived early, choosing a seat in the back corner where she hoped to remain invisible. The other students filtered in with their designer backpacks and casual confidence, discussing weekend plans at Martha's Vineyard and spring break trips to Europe. Eleanor clutched her notebook, a simple composition book from the dollar store, and tried to make herself smaller. When Patricia began the lecture on moral relativism, Eleanor found herself transported. This was what she had been craving, real intellectual discourse, complex ideas presented and dissected with precision. She took notes frantically, her pen flying across the page as she connected concepts to her own self-guided reading. But it was during the discussion portion that everything changed. One student, a junior named Bradley Whitmore III, whose great-grandfather's name was engraved on the building they sat in, dominated the conversation with confident but shallow observations. He spoke about moral frameworks as if they were fashion trends, dismissing centuries of philosophical thought with casual arrogance. "I mean, really," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, "how can we take moral relativism seriously when it essentially argues that truth is just, like whatever feels right to different cultures? It's intellectual chaos." Elena felt her hand rise almost involuntarily. Patricia nodded at her encouragingly. "Actually," Elena began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "moral relativism isn't arguing for intellectual chaos. It's recognizing that moral judgments are often contextually dependent while still allowing for meaningful ethical discourse. Hammond's work on moral relativism, for instance, suggests that moral facts are always relative to agreements or moral frameworks. But this doesn't eliminate the possibility of reasoned moral debate. It just requires us to be more precise about the frameworks we're operating within." The classroom fell silent. Bradley stared at her, clearly trying to process not just what she had said, but who had said it. Here was someone he didn't recognize, speaking with an authority and depth that made his own comments seem superficial by comparison. "I'm sorry," Bradley said, his voice taking on a condescending tone, "but are you even enrolled in this class? Because that's a pretty advanced interpretation for someone who's probably just auditing intro-level philosophy." Heat rose in Elena's cheeks, but before she could respond, Patricia intervened. "Elena is here as my guest," she said firmly, "and her analysis is not only accurate, but more sophisticated than most graduate-level discussions I've heard on this topic." But Bradley wasn't finished. As the class ended and students began packing their bags, he approached Elena with that same smirk still playing on his lips. "Look," he said, loud enough for several nearby students to hear, "I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but places like this, places like Whitmore, places like Harvard, they're not for everyone. Some people are just meant to work in different capacities. There's no shame in that." Eleanor felt the weight of every assumption Bradley was making about her, her clothes, her notebook, her accent, her very presence in that classroom. But it was his next words that would burn themselves into her memory. "You seem smart enough," he continued with a patronizing smile. "But let's be realistic. You don't belong at Harvard. You probably don't even belong here." And then he laughed. A short, dismissive sound that contained centuries of privilege and exclusion, the kind of laugh that had kept people like Elena on the outside, looking in for generations. Elena stood frozen as Bradley walked away, surrounded by his friends who shared his amusement. She felt exposed, humiliated, and suddenly very aware of how different she was from everyone else in that room. The confidence she had felt while discussing moral relativism evaporated, replaced by a familiar sense of not belonging. But as she walked home that evening, taking 2 buses back to East Boston, while Bradley probably climbed into his BMW, something began to crystallize in Elena's mind. His laughter hadn't just been cruel, it had been a challenge, an assumption about limitations that she had the power to prove wrong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That night, Eleanor sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by college application materials that Patricia had provided. She looked at the Harvard application. Pages and pages of questions that seemed designed for people with very different life experiences than hers. But she also thought about those philosophy papers she'd been analyzing for years, about the conversations she had just held with actual university students, about the mind she had trained in isolation and the potential that Patricia saw in her. Elena picked up her pen and wrote at the top of her personal statement, "Excellence recognizes no boundaries." She had 18 months to prove Bradley Whitmore III wrong. 18 months to transform from the invisible girl in the back of the audited classroom to someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. And she was going to start by getting into Harvard, not despite where she came from, but because of everything that journey had taught her about resilience, determination, and the true meaning of intellectual courage. The application process would be grueling, the standardized tests challenging, and the financial aid forms overwhelming. But every time Eleanor felt discouraged, she heard Bradley's laugh echoing in her mind. And she remembered that some assumptions were made to be shattered. The Harvard application deadline loomed like a mountain peak that Elena could see but wasn't sure she could climb. 3 months had passed since Bradley's dismissive laughter, and every day brought new challenges that threatened to derail her carefully constructed plan. The SAT prep books Patricia had provided were helpful, but they couldn't replace years of expensive tutoring that her classmates at private schools had received. Elena found herself waking at 4 a.m. to study before school, then working at the local grocery store after classes to help her mother with rent, then studying again until midnight. Carmen watched her daughter's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. Elena had always been serious about her studies, but now there was an intensity that bordered on obsession. She attacked every practice test, every essay prompt, every application requirement with a fierce determination that Carmen recognized. It was the same look Elena had worn as a child when older kids told her she couldn't keep up with them in anything. "Mija," Carmen said one evening, finding Elena asleep at the kitchen table with her face pressed against a stack of vocabulary flashcards. "You push too hard. Your body needs rest." Elena stirred, blinking away the exhaustion. "I can't rest, Mama. I'm already behind everyone else. While they were taking piano lessons and traveling to Europe, I was—" "You were becoming strong," Carmen interrupted gently. "You were learning things they never will. But strength without wisdom is just stubbornness." Carmen was right, but Elena couldn't slow down. Every setback felt magnified by the weight of proving Bradley wrong. When her first SAT practice score came back lower than she needed, she didn't allow herself to feel disappointed for more than 5 minutes before diving back into the prep books. When her AP history teacher mentioned that most successful Harvard applicants had impressive extracurricular activities, Elena spent her lunch breaks researching volunteer opportunities that wouldn't interfere with her work schedule. It was during one of these lunch break research sessions that she discovered the Teen Philosophy Workshop at the Boston Public Library. The program was designed for high school students interested in exploring philosophical questions through guided discussions. Elena signed up immediately, seeing it as both an extracurricular activity and a chance to engage with the subject matter she loved most. The first workshop session was held in a small conference room on the library's 3rd floor. Elena arrived to find 12 other teenagers, most of whom clearly came from more affluent backgrounds based on their clothes and casual mentions of private schools. The workshop facilitator, Dr. James Chen, was a philosophy professor from Boston University who volunteered his time to make philosophical education more accessible. Today, we're going to explore the question, what makes someone qualified to hold an opinion? Dr. Chen began, writing the question on a whiteboard. I want you to think beyond formal education. What are the different ways someone might develop expertise or insight? As the discussion unfolded, Elena found herself energized by the intellectual exchange. Unlike her high school classes, where students often seemed disengaged, everyone here had chosen to spend their Saturday morning wrestling with complex ideas. She contributed thoughtfully to the conversation, drawing connections between different philosophical traditions and offering insights that made Dr. Chen pause and nod approvingly. After the session, a girl named Madison approached Elena. Madison attended Phillips Academy, wore designer jeans, and spoke with the confident cadence of someone accustomed to being heard. But her interest in Elena seemed genuine. That point you made about experiential knowledge versus academic knowledge was really insightful, Madison said. Are you planning to study philosophy in college? I hope so, Elena replied carefully. I'm applying to several places. Oh, cool. Where are you looking? I'm applying to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the usual suspects. My dad went to Harvard, so I'm legacy. But I still want to make sure I'm competitive on my own merits. Elena felt that familiar pang of otherness. Madison could casually mention legacy admissions and assume that everyone understood the advantages that came with it. For Elena, every aspect of the application process was uncharted territory. I'm applying to Harvard too, Elena said quietly. Madison's eyes lit up. Amazing. Maybe we'll be classmates. What's your intended concentration? Philosophy, with maybe a focus on ethics and social justice. That's so cool. I'm thinking philosophy too, but more on the metaphysics side. Have you done any research or internships in the field? Elena hesitated. How could she explain that her research consisted of analyzing discarded papers from her mother's cleaning route? That her internship was auditing classes at Whitmore University? That her philosophical education had been cobbled together from library books and late-night internet searches? I've been working independently with a professor at Whitmore University, she said finally. Oh, wow, that's impressive. independent research as a high school student. Your application must be really strong. After Madison walked away, Elena sat alone in the library conference room, staring at the whiteboard where Dr. Chen's questions still remained. What makes someone qualified to hold an opinion? She thought about Bradley's assumption that qualification came from pedigree, from belonging to the right social class, from having your name associated with the right institutions. She thought about Madison's casual confidence, built on generations of family success and social capital. But she also thought about Carmen, who had never set foot in a university classroom but possessed wisdom about resilience, sacrifice, and hope that no textbook could teach. She thought about the hours she had spent analyzing complex philosophical arguments, developing her own frameworks for understanding ethics and justice, building intellectual muscles through pure determination rather than institutional support. The weeks leading up to early admissions deadlines became a blur of activity. Elena submitted applications to Harvard, MIT, Stanford, and several other top-tier universities, along with safety schools that she hoped she wouldn't need. The application fees alone represented 2 weeks of her grocery store wages, but Patricia had helped her secure fee waivers for most schools. Her Harvard personal statement went through 17 drafts. She wrote about growing up in 2 worlds, the world of East Boston, where she lived, and the world of academia that she visited through discarded papers and audited classes. She wrote about discovering philosophy not in a classroom, but in garbage cans, about developing critical thinking skills not through guided instruction, but through necessity. She wrote about her mother's quiet strength and the way Carmen had instilled in her the belief that intelligence belonged to anyone willing to cultivate it. Most importantly, she wrote about the question that had driven her academic journey. How do we create justice in a world where opportunity is distributed unequally? It wasn't just an abstract philosophical problem for Elena, it was the central tension of her own life. The interviews were scheduled for December. Elena's Harvard interview was set for a Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop in downtown Boston. She spent hours preparing, researching common interview questions, and practicing her responses. But she also knew that this conversation would be different from any she had experienced before. This wasn't just about demonstrating her qualifications. It was about proving that someone like her belonged in spaces that had historically excluded people from her background. Her interviewer was Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a Harvard alumna who worked as a federal judge. Judge Morrison arrived at the coffee shop wearing a tailored suit and carrying herself with the quiet authority that Elena associated with truly powerful people. They exchanged pleasantries, ordered their drinks, and settled into comfortable chairs near the window. "So, Elena," Judge Morrison began, "tell me why you want to attend Harvard." Elena had practiced this answer dozens of times, but sitting across from Judge Morrison, she found herself setting aside her prepared response. "I want to attend Harvard because I believe that excellence in education should be available to anyone willing to work for it, regardless of where they come from. But more than that, I want to prove that intellectual contribution doesn't require a privileged background. It requires passionate engagement with ideas." Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly. "That's an interesting perspective. Can you give me an example of how your background has shaped your intellectual interests?" Elena told her about the discarded philosophy papers, about teaching herself to decode academic language, about the moment she realized that justice wasn't just an abstract concept, but a lived experience that affected every aspect of her daily life. "I've spent years thinking about distributive justice, not because a professor assigned Rawls' theory of justice, but because I've lived the question of how resources and opportunities should be allocated in society. When I read about the original position and the veil of ignorance, I didn't have to imagine what it would be like not to know your socioeconomic status. I understood intuitively why that thought experiment was so powerful for thinking about fairness." Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully. What would you bring to Harvard's intellectual community that might be unique? I'd bring questions that come from lived experience rather than abstract theory. I'd bring the perspective of someone who has had to think critically about justice, equality, and social mobility, not as academic exercises, but as urgent personal concerns. And I'd bring proof that intellectual excellence can flourish anywhere if it's nurtured properly. The conversation continued for nearly an hour and a half, far longer than the scheduled 45 minutes. They discussed Elena's philosophical interests, her career aspirations, and her thoughts on the role of education in promoting social justice. Judge Morrison asked challenging questions that required Elena to defend her positions and demonstrate the depth of her thinking. As they prepared to leave, Judge Morrison shook Elena's hand warmly. "Elena, this has been one of the most engaging interviews I've conducted. Your passion for ideas and your unique perspective on philosophical questions are exactly what Harvard's philosophy department needs." Elena walked home through downtown Boston, feeling cautiously optimistic. The interview had gone well, but she knew that admissions decisions involved factors beyond individual conversations. There would be hundreds of other qualified applicants, many with advantages that Elena couldn't match. But as she rode the bus back to East Boston, watching the city change from gleaming financial district to working-class neighborhoods, Elena reflected on how far she had already come. 18 months ago, she had been invisible in the back of Professor Holloway's classroom. Now she was a serious contender for admission to one of the world's most prestigious universities. The waiting period between applications and decisions stretched ahead like a vast, unknown territory. Eleanor continued her routine of work, study, and hope, carrying with her the memory of Judge Morrison's encouraging words and the echo of Bradley's dismissive laughter. Both would stay with her in the months ahead, twin motivations pushing her toward a future that was still taking shape. March 30th arrived with the kind of bitter Boston wind that cuts through winter coats and settles into bones. Elena had been checking her email obsessively for weeks, knowing that Harvard's early admission decisions were due any day. She sat in the East Boston Public Library, ostensibly working on a calculus assignment, but really just staring at her phone screen, refreshing her inbox every few minutes. When the email finally arrived at 3:47 p.m., Elena's hands trembled as she opened it. The subject line was neutral. Harvard College admissions decision. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she scrolled past the standard greeting to the paragraph that would determine her future. Dear Elena, congratulations! It is with great pleasure that we inform you of your acceptance to Harvard College's class of 2029. Elena read the sentence 3 times before the words fully registered. She had done it. Against every statistical probability, every socio-economic barrier, every assumption about who belonged at elite institutions, she had earned her place at Harvard University. The acceptance letter went on to detail her financial aid package. A full scholarship covering tuition, room, board, and even a stipend for books and personal expenses. Elena laughed out loud in the quiet library, earning disapproving looks from other patrons. She didn't care. At that moment, Bradley Whitmore III's dismissive laughter seemed like an echo from another lifetime. Carmen was working her evening shift at Whitmore University when Elena called with the news. Her mother's shriek of joy was so loud that Professor Holloway came out of her office to see what had happened. Eleanor got into Harvard. Carmen announced to anyone within earshot, her English abandoned in favor of rapid Spanish celebrations. Patricia immediately called Elena, her voice filled with the pride of a mentor who had watched potential transform into reality. I knew from that first conversation in your kitchen, she said. You have something that can't be taught, intellectual courage. Harvard is lucky to have you. But as the initial euphoria faded, Elena began to contemplate the magnitude of what lay ahead. Harvard wasn't just a university, it was an institution that had shaped American leadership for nearly 4 centuries. She would be walking the same paths as presidents, Supreme Court justices, Nobel Prize winners, and titans of industry. The weight of that legacy felt both inspiring and intimidating. The summer before freshman year passed in a blur of preparation. Elena worked double shifts at the grocery store to save money for incidental expenses that her scholarship didn't cover. She read voraciously, diving into canonical texts that she assumed her classmates would already know. Most importantly, she tried to prepare mentally for the culture shock of moving from East Boston to Cambridge, Harvard's. Freshman Orientation Week was a whirlwind of activities designed to help new students acclimate to college life. Elena moved into Weld Hall in Harvard Yard, sharing a room with a girl named Ashley from Greenwich, Connecticut, whose family owned a chain of luxury hotels. Ashley was friendly enough, but their conversations highlighted the vastly different worlds they came from. "I can't decide whether to rush Pi Phi or Kappa," Ashley mentioned casually while unpacking her extensive wardrobe. "My mom was Pi Phi, but Kappa has better connections in fashion. And I'm thinking about working in PR after graduation." Eleanor nodded politely, having no context for sorority life and uncertain whether she could even afford the dues if she wanted to join. She focused instead on her academic schedule, which included introduction to philosophy, calculus, freshman writing seminar, and social psychology. It was during her first philosophy class that Elena encountered a familiar face. The professor, Dr. William Chen, no relation to Dr. James Chen from the library workshop, was introducing the syllabus when Elena spotted Bradley Whitmore III sitting 3 rows ahead of her. He looked exactly the same, confident, privileged, and utterly at home in Harvard's academic environment. Elena's stomach tightened as memories of their encounter at Whitmore University flooded back. She had spent months using his dismissive words as motivation, but she hadn't prepared for the reality of sharing classroom space with him again. When Dr. Chen announced that the class would include several group discussions throughout the semester, Elena silently hoped she wouldn't be paired with Bradley, but the universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. 2 weeks into the semester, Dr. Chen assigned a major project. Students would work in pairs to present a philosophical argument about distributive justice, defending their position in a formal debate format. When he read the partnerships aloud, Elena's heart sank. Bradley Whitmore and Elena Martinez. After class, Bradley approached Elena with a smile that seemed genuine but carried undertones of confusion. He clearly didn't remember her from their encounter at Whitmore University, which somehow made the situation even more surreal. "Hey, Elena, right? I'm Brad. Looks like we're partners for this project. Want to grab coffee sometime this week to discuss our approach?" Elena studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition. There was none. To him, she was just another Harvard freshman, indistinguishable from any other student in their class. The girl he had dismissed and laughed at 18 months ago was completely invisible to him now that she sat in the same classroom, wore the same Harvard ID, and carried the same institutional validation. "Sure," Elena replied evenly. "Let's meet at Widener Library tomorrow afternoon." They met the next day in the library's reading room, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge and the quiet intensity of serious scholarship. Bradley came prepared with several philosophical texts and a confident outline of their potential argument. "I'm thinking we defend Rawlsian distributive justice," he said, spreading his notes across the table. "The veil of ignorance is a compelling framework, and it's pretty well established in contemporary political philosophy." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Rawls is interesting, but I wonder if his approach adequately addresses the intersection of class and other forms of social identity. What about incorporating some of Iris Marion Young's work on structural oppression?" Bradley looked surprised. "I haven't read Young. Is she contemporary?" "She died in 2006, but her work on justice and social groups is really relevant to questions about distributive fairness. She argues that justice isn't just about how goods are distributed, but about dismantling the structural processes that create unjust distributions in the first place. Elena could see Bradley processing this information, perhaps realizing that his new partner brought philosophical knowledge that complemented his own. They spent the next hour developing their argument, with Elena introducing concepts and thinkers that Bradley hadn't encountered, and Bradley contributing his own insights about classical liberal theory. As they worked together, Elena found herself in the strange position of genuinely enjoying the intellectual collaboration. Bradley was actually quite thoughtful when he wasn't performing superiority, and his questions pushed her to articulate her ideas more precisely. But the entire interaction was shadowed by the memory of his earlier dismissal and his current lack of recognition. Their project presentation was scheduled for the week before Thanksgiving break. Elena and Bradley had developed a sophisticated argument that combined Rawlsian justice theory with contemporary critiques from philosophers like Young, Miranda Fricker, and Charles Mills. They had rehearsed their presentation multiple times, with Elena handling the theoretical foundations and Bradley focusing on practical applications. On the day of their presentation, Elena stood at the front of the classroom wearing her best professional outfit, a blazer and dress pants that she had bought at a consignment store in Cambridge. She felt confident in their argument and prepared to defend their position against potential challenges. Distributive justice, Elena began, cannot be understood purely as a question of how to fairly allocate goods and resources. Instead, we must examine the structural processes that create inequality in the first place and work to dismantle systems that systematically disadvantage certain groups. She and Bradley presented their argument flawlessly, fielding questions from classmates and demonstrating a deep understanding of the philosophical complexities involved. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly throughout their presentation, occasionally making notes that Elena hoped were positive. After class, several students complimented their presentation. Madison, the girl from the teen philosophy workshop who was also in their class, approached Elena with enthusiasm. "That was brilliant," Madison said. "The way you connected structural oppression to distributive justice was so insightful. You really understand these issues in a way that goes beyond just reading the texts." Elena thanked her, but she was focused on Bradley's reaction. He seemed genuinely impressed by how well their presentation had gone, and for a moment she wondered if she should remind him of their previous encounter. Would he be embarrassed, apologetic, or would he find some way to minimize the significance of his earlier dismissal? But as she watched him gather his belongings and chat casually with other students, Elena realized something important. His recognition wasn't necessary for her validation. She had proven herself not to him, but to herself and to everyone who mattered. His earlier laughter had motivated her journey, but it no longer defined her worth. That evening, Elena called her mother from her dorm room. Carmen was just finishing her shift at Whitmore University, and Elena could hear the familiar sounds of cleaning equipment in the background. "Mija, how was your presentation?" "It went perfectly, Mama. Professor Chen said it was one of the strongest arguments he'd heard from undergraduates." Carmen's pride was audible even across the phone line. "I always knew you belonged there. Not because Harvard decided you were good enough, but because you were always good enough. The only thing that changed was that other people finally noticed." As Elena hung up the phone, she looked out her dormitory window at Harvard Yard, where centuries of students had walked the same paths she now traveled daily. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from analyzing discarded papers at her kitchen table to presenting sophisticated philosophical arguments to some of the brightest minds of her generation. But most importantly, she thought about what lay ahead. Harvard was not the destination. It was the launching pad for whatever contributions she would make to the world. And judging by the trajectory of her first semester, Those contributions would be significant indeed. Bradley Whitmore III had been wrong about many things, but perhaps most importantly, he had been wrong about the nature of belonging itself. Elena didn't belong at Harvard because the institution had granted her admission. She belonged because she had the intellectual courage to engage with complex ideas, the resilience to overcome systemic barriers, and the wisdom to transform personal struggle into broader understanding about justice and equality. The laughter that had once stung now seemed like a distant echo from a different era, a time when Elena had doubted her own place in the world of ideas. That time was over. Elena's sophomore year brought unexpected opportunities. Her freshman philosophy grades had been exceptional, earning her recognition from the department and an invitation to join Dr. Sarah Blackwood's advanced ethics seminar, typically reserved for juniors and seniors. More surprisingly, she received an email from Dean Margaret Foster requesting a meeting to discuss special academic opportunities. Dean Foster's office overlooked Harvard Yard from the third floor of University Hall. When Eleanor arrived for their appointment, she found herself sitting across from a woman whose reputation for identifying and nurturing exceptional talent was legendary throughout the university. "Elena," Dean Foster began, reviewing a thick file, "your professors speak of you in extraordinary terms. Dr. Chen's evaluation describes your philosophical insights as graduate-level sophistication with remarkable original thinking. Dr. Blackwood believes you have the potential for significant academic contribution." Elena shifted nervously in her chair. "Thank you, Dean Foster. I'm just trying to make the most of the opportunities Harvard provides. That's precisely why I wanted to speak with you. We have a unique program, the Accelerated Academic Track, that allows exceptional undergraduates to begin graduate-level coursework early. Students in this program often complete their bachelor's degree in 3 years and transition directly into our PhD program. The possibility hadn't occurred to Elena. She had been so focused on succeeding as an undergraduate that she hadn't considered what might come after graduation. "There's something else," Dean Foster continued. "The philosophy department has an opening for a teaching assistant position in their introductory courses. It's unusual to offer this to a sophomore, but your background and performance suggest you could provide valuable perspective to incoming students." Elena's mind raced. A teaching assistantship would provide additional income, but more importantly, it would give her the chance to shape other students' first encounters with philosophical thinking. "I'd be honored to accept both opportunities," Elena said. "Excellent. You'll be assisting with Professor Morrison's Introduction to Ethics course. I believe you'll find the experience illuminating." When Eleanor arrived at her first TA meeting 2 weeks later, she discovered that Professor Morrison was none other than Dr. Rebecca Morrison, the federal judge who had conducted her Harvard admissions interview 3 years earlier. Judge Morrison had taken a sabbatical from the federal bench to teach at Harvard for 1 semester. "Elena Martinez," Judge Morrison said with a warm smile. "I had a feeling our paths would cross again. Though I admit, I expected it would take a bit longer for you to be on the teaching side of the classroom." Elena's teaching responsibilities included leading discussion sections, grading papers, and holding office hours for struggling students. She approached these duties with the same intensity she brought to her own studies, preparing meticulously for each discussion section and providing detailed feedback on student work. It was during her 3rd week as a TA that she encountered a familiar face during office hours. Bradley Whitmore III knocked on her door, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Hi, I'm in Professor Morrison's Tuesday-Thursday section. I was hoping to get some help with the paper on moral relativism. I'm having trouble developing a coherent argument." Eleanor gestured to the chair across from her desk, maintaining professional composure despite the surreal nature of the situation. Here was the same person who had dismissed her intellectual capabilities 3 years earlier, now seeking her academic guidance. What specific aspect of moral relativism are you struggling with? Elena asked. Bradley pulled out his notes, which looked hastily assembled. I understand the basic concept, but I can't figure out how to respond to the criticism that relativism leads to moral chaos. Like, if every culture's moral system is equally valid, how do we make any meaningful ethical judgments? Elena recognized the exact same superficial understanding that Bradley had demonstrated in that audited class years ago. His thinking hadn't progressed much beyond surface-level objections to complex philosophical positions. That's actually a common misunderstanding of what moral relativism claims, Elena explained patiently. The position isn't that all moral systems are equally good, or that we can't make ethical judgments. It's about understanding how moral facts relate to specific contexts and frameworks. She spent the next 40 minutes walking Bradley through the nuances of different relativist positions, helping him understand the distinction between descriptive and normative relativism, and guiding him toward a more sophisticated analysis of the philosophical issues at stake. As their session concluded, Bradley gathered his papers with obvious relief. This is incredibly helpful. I feel like I actually understand the material now. You're a really good teacher. You explain things in a way that makes sense. He paused at the door, studying Eleanor's face with a puzzled expression. Have we met before? You seem familiar somehow. Elena felt a moment of decision crystallizing. She could reveal their history, force him to confront his earlier dismissal, and watch his embarrassment unfold. Or she could let the irony speak for itself. We might have crossed paths at some point, she said simply. Harvard's a small community. Bradley nodded and left, still looking slightly confused, but apparently unable to place where he might have encountered his TA before. Word of Elena's teaching effectiveness spread quickly through the philosophy department. Students consistently rated her discussion sections as the most helpful part of the course, and Professor Morrison praised her ability to make complex philosophical concepts accessible to beginning students. You have a gift for teaching, Professor Morrison told Elena after observing one of her discussion sections. You understand these ideas, not just intellectually, but in a way that allows you to guide others toward their own understanding. That's a rare talent. Elena's academic trajectory accelerated throughout her sophomore year. She published her first scholarly paper, a critique of contemporary approaches to distributive justice that drew on her analysis of structural oppression, in the Harvard Undergraduate Philosophy Review. The paper caught the attention of several prominent philosophers, including Professor David Sterling from Yale, who invited Elena to present her work at a National Undergraduate Philosophy conference. The conference was held at Princeton University in April. Elena found herself sharing panels with undergraduate students from institutions across the country, many of whom had been studying philosophy longer than her intensive 3-year journey. But when she presented her paper on structural approaches to educational justice, the response was overwhelmingly positive. During the question and answer session, a professor from Columbia asked, "Your analysis suggests that traditional approaches to educational equity focus too narrowly on individual access rather than systemic transformation. Can you elaborate on what structural change would look like in practice?" Elena's response drew directly from her own experience. Structural change requires recognizing that educational institutions themselves shape who gets to participate in knowledge creation. When we limit access based on social capital, cultural familiarity, or economic resources, we're not just excluding individuals, we're impoverishing the entire intellectual enterprise by limiting the range of perspectives and experiences that contribute to scholarly discourse. The audience, composed primarily of professors and advanced graduate students, nodded approvingly. After the session, several faculty members approached Elena with compliments and questions about her graduate school plans. Professor Sterling was among them. "Have you considered applying for our PhD program?" he asked. Your work demonstrates exactly the kind of original thinking we're looking for in graduate students." Elena thanked him for the encouragement, but her mind was already focused on something else entirely. During the conference dinner, she had overheard a conversation between two Harvard graduate students discussing teaching opportunities. One mentioned that the philosophy department was looking for a lecturer to teach summer session courses, someone who could handle introductory philosophy for visiting students and summer school participants. The position would typically go to a graduate student or recent PhD, but Elena had an idea. When she returned to Cambridge, Elena scheduled a meeting with Dr. Morrison and Dean Foster. She proposed something unprecedented, allowing her to teach her own introductory philosophy course during the summer session. Drawing on her experience as a TA and her unique perspective as someone who had come to philosophy through unconventional paths. "It's highly unusual," Dean Foster admitted. "We've never had an undergraduate lecturer before, but Eleanor's teaching evaluations are exceptional," Dr. Morrison pointed out. "And her background provides exactly the kind of perspective that could benefit students who might feel intimidated by philosophy." After considerable deliberation and review by the full philosophy faculty, Elena received approval to teach Philosophy 101, Introduction to Ethical Thinking, during Harvard's summer session. At 19 years old, she would be the youngest instructor in the university's history. News of Elena's appointment spread quickly through Harvard's academic community. The story was picked up by the Harvard Crimson, then by local Boston media, and eventually by national education publications. "From cleaning lady's daughter to Harvard professor, student breaks barriers in academia," read one headline. Elena tried to maintain focus on her preparation for the summer course, but the media attention was overwhelming. Reporters wanted to know about her background, her mother's reaction, and her plans for the future. Through it all, Elena remained grounded in the simple truth that had guided her journey. Intellectual excellence could emerge from anywhere if given the opportunity to flourish. The night before her first class as an instructor, Elena walked through Harvard Yard, thinking about the improbable path that had brought her to this moment. In less than 4 years, she had transformed from an invisible auditor in the back of a classroom to a Harvard lecturer preparing to shape the next generation of philosophical thinkers. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of her achievement was its quiet justice. Tomorrow, she would stand at the front of a Harvard classroom, not as someone who had overcome obstacles to prove she belonged, but as someone whose intellectual contributions had earned her the right to guide others in their own philosophical journeys. Bradley Whitmore III's laughter had become a distant memory, replaced by the more meaningful sound of students engaging seriously with complex ideas under Elena's guidance. She had proven him wrong, not through confrontation or revenge, but through the simple act of becoming exactly who she was meant to be: a scholar, a teacher, and a voice for educational justice in the most prestigious halls of American academia. The girl who had once cleaned these buildings alongside her mother was now preparing to educate the next generation of leaders within them. The transformation was complete, and it had happened so naturally that even those who had doubted her, including Bradley himself, had been forced to recognize her authority without ever realizing the journey she had taken to earn it. 5 years later, Dr. Elena Martinez stood before the annual Harvard Philosophy Department faculty meeting, presenting her proposal for the new Community Philosophy Initiative. At 24, she had completed her accelerated PhD program and accepted a tenure-track position, making her one of the youngest professors in Harvard's history. The initiative would create partnerships between Harvard philosophy students and community colleges throughout Massachusetts. Elena explained to her colleagues, "Our students would serve as teaching assistants and discussion leaders, while community college students would have access to Harvard's resources and philosophical expertise. The room was filled with distinguished faculty members, including several whose work Elena had studied as a teenager, analyzing discarded papers. Now she stood among them as an equal, proposing programs that would democratize access to philosophical education. Professor Emeritus Harold Whitfield, Bradley's grandfather and a major university donor, raised his hand. Dr. Martinez, while I appreciate the sentiment behind this initiative, I wonder about the practical implications. Harvard's reputation depends partly on exclusivity. Are we diluting our brand by extending our resources too broadly? Elena had anticipated this objection. Professor Whitfield, I'd argue that Harvard's reputation should rest not on exclusivity, but on excellence. When we limit access to philosophical education based on institutional prestige rather than intellectual merit, we impoverish our own discipline. Some of the most insightful questions about justice, ethics, and human nature come from people whose life experiences have given them unique perspectives on these issues. The debate that followed was spirited but respectful. Several younger faculty members supported Elena's proposal enthusiastically, while some senior professors expressed concerns about resources and academic standards. Eventually, Dean Foster called for a vote, and the Community Philosophy Initiative passed by a margin of 12-7. After the meeting, Elena walked across Harvard Yard toward her office in Emerson Hall. The building housed the philosophy department, and Elena's office was on the same floor where she had once attended discussion sections as an undergraduate. Now students knocked on her door, seeking guidance on everything from Aristotelian ethics to contemporary debates about artificial intelligence and moral responsibility. Her current research focused on educational justice and the epistemology of social identity, examining how different social positions produce different forms of knowledge and understanding. The work drew directly from her own experience while contributing to broader scholarly conversations about diversity in academia. Elena's office walls displayed her diploma, several academic awards, and a framed photograph of Carmen at Elena's PhD graduation ceremony. Carmen had insisted on wearing her finest dress, a navy blue outfit she had bought specifically for the occasion, and her smile in the photo radiated the pride of a mother who had always believed in her daughter's potential. Carmen still worked part-time at Whitmore University. Though she could have retired on Elena's salary, she enjoyed the work and had developed friendships with several faculty members who respected her insights about university life from a unique perspective. Professor Holloway, who had become like family to both women, often consulted Carmen about the practical challenges facing first-generation college students. Elena's computer chimed with a new email from the Harvard Summer School office. One of her former undergraduate students, now a senior, was requesting permission to audit her advanced seminar on philosophy of education and social justice. The student's name made Elena pause. Bradley Whitmore III. She leaned back in her chair, considering the request. Bradley had taken 3 of her courses over the past 2 years, consistently earning solid B+ grades through diligent work rather than natural insight. He had matured significantly since their undergraduate days, developing a genuine interest in philosophical questions about inequality and social responsibility. More importantly, he had never connected her to the girl he had dismissed years earlier at Whitmore University. Elena had watched him struggle with this cognitive dissonance during office hours, clearly sensing something familiar about her but unable to place the memory. She had decided long ago not to enlighten him, finding more satisfaction in watching him learn to respect intellectual authority that he couldn't dismiss based on social assumptions. Elena approved his audit request and returned to preparing for her afternoon seminar. Today's topic was recognition and misrecognition in educational contexts, an exploration of how social identity affects whose knowledge gets valued and whose perspectives get marginalized in academic Settings: her students filed in promptly at 2 p.m. 8 graduate students and 3 advanced undergraduates working on honors theses. They had spent the semester examining case studies of educational exclusion and developing theoretical frameworks for understanding how institutions could become more genuinely inclusive. Today, I want to discuss a specific case study, Elena began, though I'm going to present it somewhat differently than usual. Instead of analyzing a historical example, I want you to consider a hypothetical scenario. She outlined the situation: a brilliant student from a working-class background who gains access to elite education through merit and determination, eventually becoming a professor. The question is, what does this transformation tell us about the nature of intellectual authority and social recognition? Graduate student Sarah Chen raised her hand. It seems like a clear case of the meritocratic ideal working as intended. Talent rises regardless of background, but does it? Challenged Marcus Thompson, another graduate student. Or does it represent exceptional individual success that masks systemic barriers? One person succeeding doesn't mean the system is just, Elena nodded approvingly. Marcus raises an important point. How do we distinguish between individual achievement and structural change? The discussion continued for 90 minutes, with students wrestling with questions about meritocracy, social mobility, and the role of elite institutions in perpetuating or challenging inequality. Elena guided the conversation skillfully, helping students recognize the complexity of these issues while avoiding easy answers. As class ended, Bradley approached Elena's desk. Professor Martinez, I've been thinking about something all semester. Your approach to these questions, it's like you have lived experience with educational barriers, not just theoretical knowledge. It makes your teaching incredibly powerful. Elena looked at him thoughtfully. What makes you say that? Just the way you understand the emotional reality of feeling like an outsider in academic spaces. Most professors talk about exclusion abstractly, but you seem to grasp the psychological impact in a deeper way. For a moment, Elena considered revealing their shared history. She imagined his shock, his embarrassment, his inevitable apologies. But she realized that doing so would make the conversation about his past behavior rather than the ideas they had been exploring. I think good philosophy requires taking seriously the full range of human experience, she said instead. When we limit ourselves to perspectives that come from privileged positions, we miss important insights about justice, knowledge, and human flourishing. Bradley nodded seriously. That's exactly what I mean. You've changed how I think about who gets to be a philosopher and what kinds of questions matter. After he left, Elena remained in her office, grading papers and responding to emails. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Bradley had become a better thinker precisely because he had learned to listen to voices he might once have dismissed. His intellectual growth was a small example of the broader transformation that Elena hoped to foster through her teaching and research. As evening approached, Elena packed her materials and prepared to head home to the apartment she shared with her partner David, a public interest lawyer she had met during graduate school. Carmen would be joining them for dinner, a weekly tradition that helped maintain their close relationship despite Elena's demanding schedule. Walking through Harvard Square, Elena reflected on the unexpected trajectory of her life. The girl, who had once felt invisible in these spaces, now shaped the intellectual development of future scholars, policymakers, and leaders. Her research influenced academic conversations about educational justice, and her teaching inspired students to think more carefully about inclusion and recognition. But perhaps most importantly, Elena had proven that intellectual excellence could emerge from anywhere, and that the most profound insights about justice often came from those who had experienced injustice firsthand. She had transformed not just her own circumstances, but the very understanding of who could be a philosopher and what kinds of knowledge mattered in academic discourse. Bradley's laughter had set her on this path, but it was Elena's own determination, intelligence, and moral clarity that had carried her to this destination. She belonged at Harvard, not because an admissions committee had decided she was worthy, but because she had something valuable to contribute to the ongoing human conversation about truth, justice, and the good life. And in the end, that was the most satisfying victory of all, not proving her worth to those who had doubted her, but demonstrating through her work that wisdom and insight belonged to anyone courageous enough to pursue them, regardless of where that pursuit began. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.